Good morning. Buenos dias. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our final plenary speaker, Pablo Delano. I've called Pablo a colleague and friend for 25 years, so coming up with a concise introduction that captures the complex spirit and vast artistic intellectualism or intellectual artistry of mi amigo y hermano is impossible, so I'll hold to a very few points of interest. Pablo received his MFA from Yale University and is currently the Charles A. Dana Professor of Fine Arts at Trinity College, where he earned the Trustee Award for Excellence in 2009 and the Charles A. Dana Research Professorship from 2019 to 2021. A renowned photographer with too many exhibits and permanent public photography installations to list, his books include Faces of America, published by the Smithsonian Institution Press in 1992, In Trinidad, published by Ian Randall in 2008, and Hartford Scene, published in 2020 by Wesleyan University Press. The titles give you a small idea of the breadth of his photographic work, which always endeavors to capture the rich complexity, the oddities, the heart, the resilient spirit of human beings and the worlds they've created. Pablo's work and impact as an artist go far beyond his spectacular photography. When Wendy, Alexa, and I sat down about a year ago to discuss plenary speakers for this conference, thinking about the theme of hospitality and the ways we have always sought to deeply question and problematize that concept through our CAS Hospitality Initiative, Pablo was the first artist who came to my mind. Particularly, I knew we had to bring to this conversation a presentation on his conceptual art installation, the Museum of the Old Colony. I won't say much about this work because the artist himself is here to talk about it, but I will claim the honor of having been present for its very first iteration in a small, I want to say like 12 by 14 foot, 8 by 10, even smaller, 8 by 10 foot, 3-walled room in Alice Yard in Trinidad. The brilliance of the concept was apparent even then, and it has been absolutely no surprise to me to see the places the museum has traveled or the dimensions it's grown. Its selection for a much, much larger installation in the 2024 Venice Biennale, while exciting for sure, also felt to me like an, of course, a logical recognition of a long and brilliant career. So I won't say any more for now, because I know you prefer to hear from Pablo himself, so please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Aquí hay boricuas. As a visual artist, it's somewhat awkward to talk about my work. These are two quotes that resonate with me. I explained it when I danced it. That's from Margot Fontaine. And a quote I discovered just yesterday at the Carnegie Museum by the painter Raymond Saunders, who said, "I'm not sure I want to say what I do. I believe that when you accommodate the public by defining and explaining, then you eliminate the element of curiosity." So I'll try to maintain some element of curiosity. In the Caribbean, the word hospitality is fraught with complex meanings and implications. It is often paired with the word industry, as in hospitality industry, meaning tourism. Puerto Rico, where I was born, raised, and educated through high school, is known worldwide for its hospitality industry. Tourism has been an important source of income and employment, drawing millions of visitors each year to its beaches, hotels, and resorts. In search of the perfect vacation, Puerto Rico is good at the art of hospitality. If you ask Google whether Puerto Ricans are known for hospitality, the answer will be yes. Even Discover Puerto Rico, the official destination marketing agency of the government of Puerto Rico, confirms that Puerto Ricans tend to be friendly and cheerful people who move their hands a lot when they talk and express their emotions with intensity and passion. But for many citizens of the Caribbean, those who call the Caribbean home, that tropical paradise so esteemed by visitors can be elusive, inaccessible, or unattainable. In the title of her 2025 book, Caribbean Inhospitality, Professor Natalie Belize refers to those citizens as strangers at home. Due to the enormous profit potential of short-term vacation rentals, many Puerto Ricans are being displaced or evicted from their longtime homes. Outside investors buy out prime properties, including protected historic sites or nature preserves, to build hotels and resorts, while corrupt government officials look the other way or line their own pockets. Yet, in the last gubernatorial election, the candidate who advocated for Puerto Rican independence came in a strong second among the 5 principal candidates with 31% of the vote. This is a dramatic increase and by far the largest vote for an independence advocating candidate in my lifetime. In the face of a massive population exodus and increased settlements by wealthy North Americans benefiting from Act 60, Puerto Ricans are resisting the tide of erasure and proclaiming Puerto Rico para los puertorriqueños, or Puerto Rico for the Puerto Ricans. Or, in the case of the Puerto Rican poet Esteban Valdez back in 1977, Puerto Rico para los puertorriqueños. The divisive nature of the hospitality industrial complex in Puerto Rico is addressed by Bad Bunny in his song Turista, from his album Debí Tirar Más Fotos, released earlier this year. So Puerto Rico, or Borinquen, was discovered in 1493 by Cristobal Colón. The indigenous Taino people met him with hospitality, but the conquistador enslaved the population, imposed his religion, and spread European diseases. Beginning with the near extermination of the Taino people, Borinquen became a colony of extraction. After the gold was gone, tobacco, coffee, and especially sugar produced with slave labor became the prime exports. Under US control, almost all arable land was converted to sugar, stripping away any possibility of food sovereignty. And the government embarked on a campaign to exploit the natural beauty and climate, encouraging the building of hotels and resorts. To be clear, the US invaded and occupied Puerto Rico as war booty in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, and the Stars and Stripes flew over La Fortaleza, the governor's palace. Since 1901, Puerto Rico has been defined largely as belonging to, has been defined legally as belonging to, but not a part of the USA. Part of the Supreme Court's justification for this designation was that Puerto Ricans were simply too different to ever be Americans. Specifically, they were too brown, and they didn't speak English. Then, in the mid-50s, this guy appeared on the scene. Born in San Juan, one of his childhood treats included drinking Old Colony brand grape soda, made and sold to this day in Puerto Rico. Colonialism isn't just a historical concept when you live it or witness it. I experienced as a child a heavily militarized post-war Puerto Rico swarming with US soldiers and sailors, military convoys taking over roads, and heritage sites appropriated and converted to golf courses for the exclusive use of commissioned officers and their families. I became aware of a huge income disparity, and I observed the servile behavior was necessary to adopt in order to get a job in the booming hospitality industry. With tax incentives and federal support, industrialization took off. Modernization programs provided better social services and an improved quality of life for many, and a new middle class emerged. But around the turn of the last century, the tax incentives expired and the factories closed. A succession of corrupt governments created an unpayable debt. Low wages, record high prices, and a series of natural disasters resulted in the current humanitarian crisis, largely invisible to resort-bound tourists, but responsible for a crippling brain drain and the out-migration of 750,000 people in the last 10 years. President Obama in 2016 signed basically created a fiscal dictatorship known as the Promesa Bill, which imposed a fiscal control board responsible for all financial decisions, and basically did away with any semblance, any pretense of democracy. And then, of course, in 2018, after Hurricane Maria, we had Trump come and throw paper towels. What is an artist to do? I felt an inescapable need to finally address directly the colonial situation of Puerto Rico in my work. By most accounts, Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world. The question for me was how to proceed. Ta-da! The Museum of the Old Colony is the idea I came up with, a conceptual art installation, a piece of performative art employing a methodology of appropriation. Appropriation to take ownership over the very tools that were used to oppress us, in order to turn them back against the oppressor by recontextualizing them. The Museum of the Old Colony appropriates the institutional authority of the museum, the colonizer's narrative, and the historical archive, including images, texts, motion pictures, and objects. The Museum of the Old Colony reclaims, interrogates, subverts, mocks, recontextualizes, provokes, agitates as a strategy towards self-awareness, self-critique, empowerment, liberation, and decolonization. The Museum of the Old Colony poses many questions, including what is your personal complicity in the colonial system? What is our personal complicity in the colonial system? What is the complicity of the museum in empire building and colonial domination? Probably the first museum I ever saw was the Museum of Natural History in San Juan. It was a stuffy, miserable place that smelled like mold and formaldehyde, but I was mesmerized as a small child. I was also taken, when I was a little older, to visit the Museum of Natural History in New York City, where natives from other cultures could be observed living their static lives behind glass panels. And ever since, I have been fascinated by museums and their presumed roles as beacons of truth and beauty. One of the strategies I employed for my project was to appropriate the grammar and syntax of museum culture. For example, the whole idea of the timeline and of the vitrine, the protective glass box. So on the left you see a kind of centerpiece of this installation, an Old Colony bottle timeline. I introduce objects that would resonate in provocative ways and offer a counterpoint to the images. Objects from classical art, objects from popular art, kitsch, etc. I use gold frames, not for the artwork, but for the wall labels as a kind of way to turn things on their heads. I made a conscious and deliberate decision to mount the prints with push pins. Push pins, of course, are not allowed in a proper museum. They're too informal and they damage the walls. Maybe later, if we have time, I can tell you about the time that the project was rejected from a museum because they insisted on using frames, and I said, no, it has to be push pins. Not only push pins, but it has to be gold. Gold has all kinds of implications in terms of what the colony of extraction was for, right? To extract. So the colored gold is used in a symbolic way throughout the installation. I used texts and photo captions. Often the captions were not by the photographers themselves. This is an example of the kind of really offensive and hurtful captions that were used, and I quote directly, I scan directly, and employ them directly into the installation. So just take a minute and read that caption if you don't mind. I can't read it aloud because I'll throw up. Obviously, I also used images, photographs from historical and archival sources. Often those captions, the photographs had double meanings in the captions. So the photographs were not taken by me, they were taken by the colonizer. I also employed motion pictures. In the same way that I appropriated still images, I appropriated footage, film footage, historical film footage, and remixed it in video art pieces that were projected in a loop in various two different walls of the installation. To keep up the vocabulary and its use of museum tropes, I also created an official stamp so that all the artwork in the Museum of the Old Colony is stamped with the official Museum of the Old Colony stamp. And there's a Museum of the Old Colony website, which you can visit. As Anne mentioned, the project took off and has been exhibited in a series of museums and galleries around the world, from Argentina to Jamaica, and most recently at the Venice Biennale, which we'll talk about in a minute. I want to focus first on the version that was presented at the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Puerto Rico, the Contemporary Art Museum in Puerto Rico, where the director of the museum invited me to mount the exhibit just after Hurricane Maria. It was the first exhibit that opened in the museum after Hurricane Maria as part of a larger exhibit. And the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Juan actually acquired this earlier version of the exhibit, which you see here. The exhibit, or the installation was remounted in 2023 as part of another large exhibit they were doing of works from their permanent collection. And it was seen there by Adriano Pedrosa, who was named to be curator of the Venice Biennale. And I was incredibly honored and blown away because people started texting me and sending me messages. Hey, did you know Pedrosa posted your picture on Instagram? He has a huge Instagram following. And he went to Puerto Rico as part of his travels all over the world to find work for the Biennale. And the only thing he posted from his trip to Puerto Rico was 10 pictures of my installation. And he tagged me and reached out to me, so that began a conversation, a series of Zoom meetings. If you're not aware, the Venice Biennale is I feel uncomfortable saying this because it sounds like an ego thing, but if you Google it, it will tell you it's the most prestigious art festival in the world. It's got a very, very long history. So I was blown away, incredibly honored that Adriano Pedrosa would even consider placing this project in the Biennale. New York Times wrote a long article about Pedrosa and the Biennale. He's the first curator of the Biennale from the Global South, the first openly queer curator of the Biennale. And all this in the context of Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, representing the far-right fascist party in Italy. The Biennale has always been a political space, and 2024 was no different. And as the host city, Venice had a lot at stake nearly 1 million people visit the Art Biennale every 2 years. Part of the history for context, in 1968, student protests resulted in reforms to the Biennale bylaws, which had remained unchanged since the time of Mussolini. A bit later, Pedrosa announced the theme of the Biennale, Foreigners Everywhere, because there's a kind of thematic grounding to the whole exhibit. The Biennale consists of two main sections. There's the International Art Exposition, which takes place in the Central Pavilion of the Giardini venue and also in the Arsenale. And then there are also independent pavilions that are sponsored by the government of each country. So sometimes people say it's like the Olympics of art, because many countries have their own little pavilions and their governments choose an artist to represent them. With the announcement of the theme in June 2023, things got more political. Many in Meloni's government are, after all, are anti-migrant, and Pedrosa's theme, Foreigners Everywhere, alludes to this idea of migrants everywhere. Foreigners Everywhere also resonated with me personally, because it seems to define what Puerto Ricans are. We are foreigners everywhere. We're foreigners in our own country. We're foreigners when we travel. We're foreigners in the country that colonized us. And oddly enough, I realize now it oddly echoes the subtitle of Professor Bali's book, Caribbean Inhospitality, Strangers at Home, Foreigners Everywhere. So I had had several conversations with Pedrosa at that point, but I had not been formally invited to participate. And I wrote to him and I said that, I don't know whether you're thinking still of inviting me or whether this is going to be a part of it or not, but I do hope you invite some artists from Puerto Rico, because it fits so well with being foreigners everywhere. And that resulted in the email, let's talk. And so then I was actually invited to present the project in Venice, and there I was in Venice. The exhibition space that Adriano offered me was at the heart of the Central Pavilion, which is the oldest and most historic, by far the largest of the Biennale exhibition halls within the Giardini venue, which is the oldest venue. There's another space called Arsenale that became part later of the Biennale. But immediately I became aware of Pedrosa's vision as he commissioned indigenous artists from the Amazon to paint a mural on the venerable facade of the Central Pavilion. I was assigned a space in the Central Pavilion at the Giardini, and he was very much aware that Puerto Rico is not allowed to have a national pavilion because Puerto Rico is not legally a country. So in a way, my exhibition, the Museum of the Old Colony, became a de facto Puerto Rican pavilion. On the left you see the black area represents the Central Pavilion within the Giardini venue, which is a large, beautifully landscape space. And on the right you see that I was assigned the largest space in the central location, the largest space assigned to a single artist. So for me it was overwhelmingly the responsibility, very intense responsibility I felt to take on this role. Each iteration of the Museum of the Old Colony is site-specific, not only in adapting to a new gallery or exhibition space, but in reflecting local issues or concerns. I knew that Puerto Rico and Venice, Italy, were very different, but were also affected by similar issues such as the impact of the hospitality industry, displacement of long-time residents in order to turn their homes into Airbnb rentals, the environmental impact of cruise ships, and I'll come back to that. So I arrived in Italy about 5 weeks before the Biennale opened, walked into the space and found that the walls that I had asked to be built had been built, the paint scheme had been executed, and it really was quite a powerful moment for me walking into that space. All the artwork that had been carefully packed up was being taken out of the crates, and the central focus of the exhibit, which is this desk, was taken out of its padded crate and put into place, and they photographed every square inch of it to make sure it had not gotten damaged or scratched, which is ironic since I got it on Facebook Marketplace for practically nothing. But it's just the right desk. Installation process began with an incredible team of art handlers and very bureaucratic, very stratified, but it was an extraordinary experience. Nobody ever said no to anything I asked for. Of course, you're the artist. Of course, you can. Yes, yeah. Right. So I'll share with you a few images from the installation. This was the introductory text panel, which was in English and Italian, which are the two languages of the Biennale. And so here's an example of the way the objects interact with photographs. The objects, all of the objects are imbued with or articulate some aspect of our colonial history. For example, these are foods that didn't exist before the US occupation. Corned beef has become now a Puerto Rican dish. Corned beef con papas is with potatoes and it's kind of in a tomato sauce. And the soda cracker, or the export sodas, are in every Puerto Rican home. One important aspect of the installation was, and this was I learned out of experience, is that people couldn't believe that these images were real and that these texts were real. They thought I had invented it or photoshopped it or created it somehow. So part of the conceptual basis of the show was to include the sources for everything. So if you take out your phones and you scan this, you will be taken to the listing which Biennale visitors had access to. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, I'll go back to the QR code. That QR code was available, and if you scan it, you will go right to the same website which Biennale visitors could go to and see the source for every single image and every single piece of film footage in the exhibit. So here's an overall view of the installation, which doesn't, and it's very hard to photograph it to get the sense of how immersive it is. This in a way is better. This was the museum desk, which sort of represents the where my fictional character of the curator, director, or whatever would sit. The desk is covered with objects, including objects that have, double meanings or subtext, such as this idea of blue white lies, which is an actual object that, I found this thing, couldn't believe it. I wanted a jar for blue white lies, and I didn't want to make it. I wanted to find one that existed, and to my surprise, such a thing actually exists, and I was able to locate. Did very little intervention, very little manipulation of any of the objects. This is one exception. I did create this little trophy which says the camera cannot lie, which of course is a big lie. All the photographs are taken by outsiders, by US photographers, or by local photographers who are beholden to colonial powers. And this is a detail of the wall behind the desk. This is kind of became the centerpiece of the exhibit, these two images. Does anybody know who the woman on the left is?
Yes.
Lolita Lebron. So this is a way, in a way, it speaks to issues of hospitality, since it's the theme of the conference. Who is this lady, and who is the art for, right? So if you know, you know. And if you don't know, that's okay, because you still have two striking pictures that work in a way and evoke something, right? But if you know who Lolita Lebron was, she was a woman who entered the US Congress the year I was born, actually, with a Luger and shot it into the air, and some of her accomplices went in there with her, shot at the congressman and injured some, and she was imprisoned for much of her life. I think it was Jimmy Carter or Clinton released her, finally let her out after serving a very long sentence. She's regarded by many as a terrorist, and by others as a kind of hero, because she had a note inside her clothing saying, I didn't come to kill anyone, I came to die for Puerto Rico. So it sets up a double language, right? Some people will feel more at home, they'll understand, and it'll resonate more deeply than others. And I think that's okay. This is a grouping of images that has to do with the elites, with social class and racial stratification. So I placed the old colony timeline right in the middle. This is a section that deals with the diaspora, the Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States, and the toy is a representation of a soft and safe Hispanic family. Right? The traditional gender roles, right? The father, the mother, and the boy and the girl. Visitors to the Biennale were blown away by this piece, by this object, and even more so when I told them I just bought it on Amazon. This is another section that deals with the debt, which is more and more becoming a crippling issue. You can see one of the video projections on the right. This are some images that deal with tourism and the hospitality industry, the tourist trade, which often results in the production of objects for the consumption of tourists, things to bring home to remember their trip. And I was very taken by the fact that Venice, which also depends heavily on tourism and hospitality, has very similar kinds of tacky souvenirs. I don't know how many Venetians attended the Biennale. I know there were some there, and Venetian school children would come. And I hope that they would make these connections. A lot of the way that I customized the show for Venice took into account some of the similarities, even though they're very different, right? Venice is an island, Puerto Rico is an island, they're dependent on the sea. This was a section dealing with the imposition of the English language, which the U.S. government did from the time of the invasion up until 1947, when they just realized this just was not going to work. All public education was supposed to be in English, and they had inspectors that would go around, and when the inspectors would come in, the teachers would switch to fake English, which was undetected by the inspectors because the inspectors didn't speak English either. Right? So, but in any case, it was by law, English was the language of instruction. The Patriot Economy Eraser is an actual, real object that was sold, and was a benefactor donated to the Museum of the Old Colony. He found it in the boardroom of the place that he worked. There's a lot of talk now about the fact that our culture is being erased, so there it is, erased. The Venetians seem to be in a better place to police the hospitality industry. There are clearly stated rules of behavior and stiff fines for those who violate them. Sadly, in Puerto Rico, tourists can just about get away with murder, and they certainly can almost get away with arson, as we saw earlier this year when an American tourist arrived in a restaurant in the town of Cabo Rojo. The restaurant was closed. The chairs were up on the tables. The staff was leaving. She insisted on being served, and when she was told, "Sorry, we're closed," she came back with a can of gasoline and burned it to the ground. She was able to walk away. go back to her hotel, and the next day get on a flight and return home. Nothing happened until about a month later. Finally, they investigated and she got arrested. The people in Venice seemed to be actively involved in discussing ways to regulate short-term rentals. There was strong consciousness of what this was doing to the city, and this was a poster that came up calling for a town meeting to discuss the impact of short-term rentals. Another way in which I altered the installation to evoke issues important to both Puerto Rico and Venice was the question of migrants. One of the video pieces, there were two video pieces. This is the second. I say the second because it's chronologically. One of the video pieces dealt with earlier historical footage. This video dealt with what's happening today, and almost all the footage is from the last year or two. And this was a homemade video that somebody took in the west coast of Puerto Rico. This boat had actually come in with full of Dominican migrants. So the whole question of migrants, we know the Mediterranean, these ships are sinking all the time with migrants. And so, then finally, opening day, and it was packed. It blew my mind. If you look in the center of the photograph, way in the distance, you see that little bright red sign. That's the neon sign that says foreigners everywhere. I stayed for a couple of weeks after the Biennale opened, and every day there were hundreds of thousands of people going through the Central Pavilion. My exhibition, the Museum of the Old Colony, was in the center, as you saw on the map, in the center of the Central Pavilion. It was hard to avoid it. You had to see it, and watching how people react to it was very powerful experience for me. There was medics there in case anybody had a heart attack. They were ready to resuscitate you. There were cops. I was a bit of a fashion show. Some were there to show off. Some were identifying with what they were seeing. There were some, had an incredibly powerful connection with some visitors from South Africa who, even as a completely different place, but they identified very deeply with what the exhibit was about. And some of the interactions were absolutely bizarre. The image on the left is from the installation, and the source is a scrapbook that I was able to locate from an American sailor who probably died, and probably his family just tossed out the albums into the garbage, and somebody rescued them and was selling them at a flea market. And it depicts, a U.S. sailor in this dubious handshake with a Puerto Rican laborer, and guests to the Biennale felt it was somehow either clever or funny to emulate the picture, and they asked a friend of mine to take their picture, shaking hands with the picture of the people shaking hands. Very strange. So who knows if they were paying tribute to the image, mocking, reenacting the colonial moment, who knows. It meant a lot for Puerto Ricans to enter the space. Many people were in tears. They wrote to me, got a lot of comments about how moved they were, especially because within the context of the international art world, we are a nation, but we're not legally allowed to be a nation. All right, so it was very emotional for many people. Strangers sent me selfies, but so did good friends. On the left is my friend, the wonderful painter Barbara Tapia. A couple of months after her visit to the Biennale, Barbara began to feel very sick and went to the emergency room at a hospital in San Juan. The overworked medical staff sent her home. She returned and was sent home, again, 3 times. By the time they finally admitted her, it was too late. She died in surgery. But we are still here. Boricua artists gathering at a collateral exhibition at the Biennale. So if you know any Boricua artists, as you know, Chemi Rosado Seijo, Awilda Sterling Dupre, whose work has been in the Whitney, Daniel Lynn Ramos also had a show at MoMA PS1. We're all there as part of this collateral. We had this wonderful moment where we came together and celebrated being there. Venecia para los puertorriqueños. So finally, I'll end with a quote from Reverendo Pedro Pietri, who was one of the founders of the New York poetry movement, who said, to defend your dreams means to have the courage to make your dreams come true in your lifetime. And once your dreams come true, you will never have to worry about dying as long as you live. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take this.
So we have some time for questions if you want to raise your hand on either side of the room.
No, it's the last day of the conference.
I guess I would be curious to know whether you were, I'm sorry.
I would be curious to know whether you witnessed reactions by, quote, American tourists, to, if they were there, to seeing this.
Yes. But I think that has to be answered in the context of the crowd that would be attracted to go to the Biennale in the first place. One of the most interesting reactions from an American was a woman from Connecticut who had actually spent time in Puerto Rico and been there, and her feedback was very curious to me, because she said to me, one of the things I like about this exhibit is that you're not making any judgments. You're just putting out the facts the way they are, and people can make up their own minds. So okay, if that's the way you see it, that's fine. You know? Yeah. But most of the reactions were not so much from Americans, but from others, Italians, and
Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry. That's my fault.
Hello? Okay. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Jacqueline Cofield, and I work as a Jauntis Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art. When I started as a teaching fellow, the first exhibition was No Existe un Mundo Cuyo Recan, which was curated by my Puerto Rican curator, Mercedes. And I'm really excited. She's going to be curating the 2026 Whitney Biennale. And I'm really fascinated by the artist-curator role that you play, and I just want to ask you about that aspect, because here you are not just engaging in your artistic practice, but you're engaging with that of other artists. And so I wanted to know, like, what are some of your motivations or complications in that role of that dual role of artist-curator?
Well, that brings up a point that I wanted to integrate into the talk, but I couldn't quite figure out how, so now you've given me an excuse to do it. And that's the role of play, and the importance of play in the process of creating art, making art. And for me, it's very important. The one project that I spent about 10 years working on before getting into this project, and it actually served as a kind of motivation and a kind of inspiration for this project, was I spent 10 years in Trinidad, in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, which was really important for my development, because unlike Puerto Rico, Trinidad achieved independence in the 60s. And so that's a fairly new so it's a pretty young country in the sense that it was able to shed the yoke of British colonialism, although of course that's still a part woven into the structure of society, but it was able to shed that yoke of colonialism and was struggling to define itself as a nation and making conscious decisions about how do we define ourselves, what is our national identity, what does it consist of. So one of the decisions that they consciously made, Prime Minister Eric Williams was very conscious and aware of this, was to make Carnival an essential part of that nation-building toolkit. And Carnival is about play, and it's about taking on roles, and about the idea of performance. This is a very, very simplistic way of looking at Carnival, but often people do look at it as a kind of time when roles can be inverted, and when it's permitted to mock the colonizer without repercussions, without being punished for it. And so that time, I spent 10 years photographing there, and I published a book called In Trinidad, which is in black and white, which is everybody got upset about because you're supposed to photograph the Caribbean in color, but it wasn't about the beaches, and it wasn't even about Carnival really, although there's in the festive sense so much, but it's about identity, the search for identity, nation building. So the idea of play was essential to me, and so for me this is serious, but it's a very serious, but it's also play, it's also a game. So I get to take on all these roles. So I'm not just the curator, I'm the designer, I'm the lighting designer, I'm the PR person. I do everything. It's like all me. And so, on that in that image of the desk. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Right. That's where the authority. That's where the colonizer/curator sits, because it's ostensibly like a colonial, museum that celebrates these horrible images that were taken to as propaganda to promote the idea of why the U.S. should have colonies. And so there's the desk there. There's a jacket. There's like cigarette butts, even though I don't smoke. I actually had the Biennale workers put their butts on. They thought it was very funny. Yeah, I mean, but it is confusing to people, and sometimes people say I'm a collector or a curator, but as Maurice Berger said, and that's often why when I do the show, the subtitle is an art installation by Pablo Delano to clarify that this is an artwork and not a collection of nostalgic pictures, which people sometimes see it as.
Hi, I'm Robin. Thank you for this. I feel like it was reflective in my own world, coming from Vermont, and having a lot of visitors love the beauty, the skiing, the foliage, especially during COVID, where people just moved in and they bought the homes and the land. And every year I would see more and more of our students being homeless and having less places and opportunities. And so my question is, how do you teach people to be gracious guests? And kind of like that feeling of, when you go into the woods, leave no trace behind, so this kind of brings up my teacher piece, and how do we teach people to be gracious guests?
Well, that brings up another question, which is, who is this artwork for? Like, is that really my role, or do I really even care about that at all? Because the situation in Puerto Rico is very complicated. There's probably, I guess you could say, an extreme case of Stockholm syndrome, in the sense that people And those of you, I know there's some who are from colonized countries, will know that the colonized often adopt the ways of the colonizer to a kind of sick degree, right? And there's this idea that you cannot succeed. Like we have a wonderful university in Puerto Rico. The University of Puerto Rico is an extraordinary university, really one of the greatest universities in Latin America. But there's this idea that you can't succeed unless you go to Hartford, or unless you go to Yale, or unless you go to Oxford. In the British Caribbean, it's Oxford or Cambridge, right? In the U.S. and Puerto Rico.
You don't speak English in my country.
Right.
You can't succeed if you're not
Right, and the Indian students that we have, where I teach at Trinity College, they say, well, my first language was English.
How can it be? It cannot be.
Okay. I'm inclined to say I don't care about that, but at the same time, I do feel that the piece plays a role in that by raising awareness. So that, but it goes to this question that it's really speaking to two groups. It's speaking to Boricuas, Puerto Rican people who see their history and they're like, oh, now, you know, it might give insight into why we need to resist this pressure that we're under, especially now, to become erased, to become assimilated, to get rid of the English language, to become, like Hawaii, where only 5% of the people who are left in Hawaii are actually native Hawaiians. We've resisted so far, right? Most people, you go to Puerto Rico and you'll hear Spanish everywhere, not English, even though from 1898 the language was attempted to be imposed. On the other hand, people from around the world who may consider a lovely vacation, this might open their eyes, and they might spend some time trying to see other sides of the culture and the island, not just, and they might, you know, as some of you know, a lot of these resorts are completely closed. Like you can't, in Jamaica, you can't even leave the resort. They're told you'll be killed if you leave the resort. Not quite to that extent in Puerto Rico, but there are more and more and more of these closed resorts being built. So maybe somebody who sees this will understand there's more to it than that. Certainly, I met many more Italians and Europeans at the Biennale, very few, not too many Americans that I met there, although there were some. But I do think that the exhibit can play a role in raising awareness and in becoming, and hopefully people seeing it in a new light.
Time for one more.
Thank you, Pablo. This is such a fantastic exhibit. I'm Wendy. We've met before.
Yeah.
You just mentioned language, and one of the things that really struck me about the work that you presented to us is how much language also plays a role in this, and particularly the double meanings. You know, economy eraser. Like obviously, it's both the cheap eraser and it also erases the economy, or little white lies. And I would just love to hear you talk.
It's the economy patriot eraser.
Right, yes. And there were many other moments where I was like, oh, there's a double, triple meaning here. And I'd love to hear you talk a little more about that aspect of this, and particularly, the fact that these are mainly plays on language in English, but the main language in Puerto Rico is not English, or, I guess, anyway. Just to talk about sort of how that figures into your work and how much you're also kind of seeking those, moments out where you find something that has that double, triple meaning that kind of gets sparks.
Unwilling subjects.
Yeah.
Right, like they were forced to pose, but they're also colonial subjects.
Yeah.
Well, English is, the whole question of language is very complicated, and I'm not quite sure how to answer. I'm using a lot of the texts are in English because those were the texts that the colonizers created, and obviously they created them in English because they were meant for North American experiences. The whole question of language, though, is very complicated within the whole, the general identity of what it means to be what it means to be Puerto Rican today. We have generations of people who were born in the U.S. and who never learned Spanish, and then they go back to the motherland and they are treated poorly or rejected. Because un gringo, you're not one of us, and so all of that. There's also the question of Spanglish, which has been embraced and rejected by scholars. Many people embrace Spanglish as a unique creation. I think the best way to answer is just to point out how complex the whole issues are. Unfortunately, it was not possible in the Biennale to include Spanish because the official languages of the Biennale are Italian and English. So it's ironic too.
Yes.
Hi Pablo. Yo hablo español como los españoles porque así me ha pasado. No sé si es una suerte o yo, pero me cayó.
Tienes que hacer la pregunta en inglés, ¿no?
I know. But this is because yesterday 4 people we visited the Ford Museum. Okay, and I invite you to visit this museum because it seems that it is yours. Because it is, you visit this museum to know more about Pittsburgh and you getting into an atmosphere or Puerto Risueños ready-made. Okay, so this museum, I don't know if you know this museum, here in Fort Mill, okay, you were seeing James Turrell installations, Yayoi Kusama colonization artworks here, okay? But we were 4 people in Fort Mill Museum. So I would like to tell you, because if the power of the historical ready-made work in Feliz Bienal to make people aware about this colonization, and if you think it's a good way to get in contact with real people, it doesn't work well nowadays.
No entiendo la pregunta.
Si crees que los ready-mades puertorriqueños, que son ready-mades, as you found them, are they the best way to connect people more than people coming from arts, or because they are domestic elements to pass the message to the audience?
I can't think about that too much.
That's picking.
I can't think about it too much. It's just what, in a way that the creation of the artwork is very intuitive. I can tell you that when my friend, Professor Nelson Rivera, who Anne knows, took his students to see the installation in el Museo de Arte Contemporáneo in San Juan, I asked him, so Nelson, what did your students think? He said they were furious. They were livid. They were so to that extent, I think that it accomplished something.
I know we're out of time, but I can just say one thing to that. One word that has resonated with me from Alishard in Trinidad, the little 8x10 room, to this, is this idea of incredulity. And so, we would see this and we would all be like gasp that these things actually exist. And it makes me wonder, what world are we living in a real world to be so incredulous about this, right? It's from the Alishard exhibit, we all thought you had made up those. And you actually changed the exhibit to really be explicit.
And that's why the QR code, and now there's always, it's either a QR code or a paper takeaway, where you can look up the number and you can go to the library and find the same book.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's right to be furious. Yeah.
Indignados is what Nelson's students said. It's not indignados, they were indignant. And so good, because now they see this is, many people in Puerto Rico want Puerto Rico to become the 51st state of the U.S., which would mean eliminating
52nd after Canada.
the language.
Greenland too.
Yeah, 54.
And now Trump has talked about selling it,
Oh, yeah.
especially after the hurricane. So.
Well, thank you, Pablo. This has been
Thank you all.
amazing.